Tonight on the Late Debate, London derailed. The city braces itself for the biggest train strikes in 30 years. And road rage. Proposals for an expanded ultra-low emission zone come under fire as Londoners are hit by the cost of living.
It will just totally wipe out my business that I've built up over the last 3 years, because people come in from everywhere to have an afternoon tea. They're not going to pay £12.50 on top.
Good evening. London is bracing itself for the impact of next week's rail strikes, which will cripple transport across the capital. With industrial action taking place across the week on both the tubes and mainline trains, there are warnings everything from businesses to schools will be impacted. Every day, tens of thousands of passengers pass through London's mainline stations. It's not always stress-free, but most of the time the capital's railways work. Next week will be different. At the very least, many rail services will be severely curtailed, if not at a complete standstill. While commuters wait to see how the strike affects them, the politicians are arguing.
Will he now break with his shadow Transport Secretary and denounce Labour's rail strike?
He wants the country to grind to a halt so he can feed off the division.
In a Commons debate, the Transport Secretary called the strikes pointless.
The last thing we need right now is to alienate passengers who are returning to the network. The unions don't seem to recognise that many commuters who before COVID had no option but to take the train now have the option not to travel at all. Say goodbye to them and we really will be in danger of the jobs of thousands of rail workers.
A former Labour leader wanted the minister to talk to the unions.
Why is he now punishing those people that kept the railway system working, that do all the difficult jobs on the railways, all a variety of them, with job losses, inadequate pay and a loss of morale?
The MP for Chesham and Amersham said more than 6,000 of her constituents rely on the train or the tube.
The right to strike is fundamental. That doesn't mean it's right to strike next week. The RMT should realise that wreaking havoc with the UK's transport system at a time like this is not going to make people more sympathetic to their cause.
Greater London is now recovering financially, economically and socially from the COVID pandemic, and this will set back our recovery in our capital city.
For London commuters, Tuesday promises to be the worst of the 3 strike days, as RMT members on the tube are also refusing to work in a separate dispute. Well, joining me now are the Labour MP for Ilford South and Shadow Transport Minister Sam Tarry. For the Conservatives, the Deputy Chair of the London Assembly, Andrew Boff. And from the Liberal Democrats, the former Transport Minister and London mayoral candidate, Baroness Susan Kramer. Welcome all of you. Sam, do you agree with your fellow Ilford MP Wes Streeting, who said at the weekend if he was a member of the RMT or a tube worker, he'd go on strike?
I think people need to understand what the strikes are actually about. People are talking about pay and conditions. They're talking about huge amounts of cuts in terms of jobs in Network Rail in particular. And the reason I mention that is because when you think of Potters Bar and you think of Hatfield, that was because of cuts that had happened that led to people losing their lives on the rail system. And so from my point of view, it's absolutely right that people are defending our rail system from those kinds of cuts.
So you back the strike?
It's not about backing the strike, it's about saying the government needs to get around the table. No worker wants to be on a strike. The RMT don't want to be doing these strikes, but what they are saying, which is right, is that these cuts are totally unnecessary and they will endanger people's lives. And the point is, well, £500 million went in as profits to train operating companies over the past few years. The rolling stock companies own the railways, own the trains, are making phenomenal profits. So they're saying, why on earth is that able to happen? And yet to pay terms and conditions are being attacked for them.
Andrew, the union says it wants to talk to Grant Shapps. Surely a meeting wouldn't harm prospects of ending this?
The last thing I read from Mick Lynch was that he didn't want to talk to any Tory government. So that's just posturing on their behalf. What we do know is that these strikes are going to damage some really vulnerable people. It's going to mean that people will be unable to go and support dependent relatives. People on very low pay are going to be unable, those who are paid by the day are going to be unable to go into work. And it's going to mean that those very vulnerable Londoners are not going to be able to be supported. Now, what we want, obviously the RMT is on a mission to disrupt as many people's lives as possible. What we want is a united front amongst politicians to say we condemn these strikes. And I know Sam danced around the issue there, but will you condemn them? Will you condemn these strikes? Because it's Londoners who are going to suffer. It's your constituents who are going to suffer as a result of this industrial action.
Nick Lynch has written to Grant Shapps in a public letter saying, I will meet you anytime, any place and get around the table and have those discussions. This is a strike of the government's making, not of the RMTs. Well, the people on strike are not train drivers, OK? As many of your colleagues are sort of putting out that kind of nonsense. They are maintenance staff. They are the people that ensure our railways on a daily basis run safely. And I think it's a complete dereliction of duty if you are saying that it's more important that the safety of Londoners for 1 or 2 days of strikes. No one wants that to happen.
You've skipped that again. You still won't condemn.
Susan, whose side are you on?
I'm on neither side in this one. We shouldn't be having the strikes next week. But I do understand that those who are working on the railways have some genuine issues. They really do. But on the other side, the government isn't getting round the table either. And when you look at the rail companies, essentially now they've been taken over in effect by the government. So trying to put the rail companies up to go and have discussions with the unions is absolutely pointless. You need the two key parties round the table. And I'd say to the unions, this is a distraction tactic by the government. You're playing into it. Don't play into it. Keep the respect of your passengers. Make sure they know you're on their side and insist that the government come round the table. That
Susan's right in so much as Grant Shapps is now the boss of the railways.
But the employers are the train operating companies. And if the government's so mean, how come it put £16 billion worth of investment into the railways during the pandemic, and they're only getting about £4 billion worth from fares? The fact is that we have been through a pandemic. The country does have financial challenges, but it looks as though the trade union bosses aren't willing to shoulder that.
No, sorry, that's complete cobblers. In Wales, under a Welsh Labour government, they did get round the table, they resolved the situation, they found the efficiencies needed, they worked together with the trade unions and didn't have any strikes, they avoided the strikes.
But some of the unions being premature here, pressing the nuclear button before there are talks.
The impact of what is being proposed by the government is going to decimate our railways. It's actually going to decimate our transport system. It's a pretty serious...
Do you accept it has to be modernised?
Of course it has to be modernised, but this is not just about modernisation. This is about austerity measures being brought into the rail sector. How on earth can we tackle climate change, getting people onto trains, when actually the system is going to be downgraded by what the government are proposing?
Susan, do you think the unions have got too much power?
I think they don't understand their relationship with the ordinary people, which is where their power comes from. They always think their power comes from their members and they have responsibility to their members. But really their power comes from the passenger base and the respect that it gives to the workforce on the railway. And I think they're putting that in jeopardy, frankly, by choosing some time like next week. So they could keep the support of passengers, of people generally, of the people who use them, and use that connection, use that tie to say to the government, you have to get round this table. Here are the details. There's modernisation to discuss, there's wages to discuss, there are a whole range of issues that need to be discussed. And I think they'd be far more effective than going to strike action.
Andrew, is the government picking a fight with the unions to deflect from its other problems?
Well, I don't think the fight is on the government's side. I mean, summarise what the unions want. They want better pay. They want better pay than the average taxpayer. They want better pensions than the average taxpayer. And they want the taxpayer to pay for that. We are going through a crisis at the moment. They should be showing restraint, they should be showing responsibility, but they're not. They're using that same old union power that discredited this country in the 70s.
Ultimately, the government bankrolls the railways, so it is the government who is picking the fight here.
But the government does bankroll the railways, and very generously.
Look, those maintenance workers on average salary of £28,000, that's hardly like a massive amount of money. That is only barely above the national average wage in this country. So it's just simply untrue. This is clearly a deflection strategy. Some people in politics call it a dead cat on the table. The government want this fight and they're gunning for this fight because they know full well that the safety measures that the RMT are talking about are genuine and they are serious. I don't want to be sitting here in a few years' time when, again, Tory cuts mean that we see passengers dead on our railway system.
Andrew, can I just ask you, as a Conservative at City Hall who worked closely with Boris Johnson, do you think he's out of the woods?
Oh, that's a segue. No.
What do you think about the way the government's behaving at the moment?
I think it's time for another direction. I think that, ultimately I judge it on how the Conservative Party is doing over this, and at the moment I don't think the current direction puts the Conservative Party in a very good light, and what we do need is a change, without doubt.
You obviously agree, Susan.
Well, what I think is that their policy advisors, I mean, I don't mean, policy towards people, but policy about how you win the next election, have gone and said, pick a fight with a major union and make sure it's headlines. Pick a fight with the European Union and make sure it's headlines. Pick a fight with asylum seekers and immigrants and make sure they're headlines. And that's what's going on. The cost of living, for goodness sake, is the crisis that is impacting just about everybody on a day-to-day basis. And that's where the total focus should be of government. So don't spend energy trying to find ways to stir up trouble in order to distract.
Clearly, the people who are picking a fight are the unions. They could negotiate with the train operating companies. They could take a responsible attitude to pay and to improvements and modernisation.
The RMT are about to sit down at the table with Network Rail in the next week or so, but it's Grant Shapps who's refusing to do that. And, as you submitted yourself, ultimately the government has supported the railways when passenger numbers dropped through the floor because of COVID. That was the right thing to do to keep the system running. But that does mean that Grant Shapps has even more responsibility as the ultimate person in charge of it. He's almost a thin controller. He can make the decision, he can avoid these strikes, and he can do it on day one. And by the way, I would say as well, I do actually agree completely with Baroness Kramer. I've just come back from Wakefield. I met a Conservative voter who'd never ever voted Labour before, so disgusted by what's going on in Westminster with Boris Johnson, and angry that he cannot afford the cost of living in terms of energy and in terms of fuel. That is what the government should be doing, instead of picking these fights and creating rows to deflect from their own mess.
It's not the government who's going on strike. I'm sure you would want them to, but it's not the government that's going on strike, it's those unions that are going on strike. They're the ones to blame. Nobody's making them go on strike.
Just to use your word, let's segue from one transport issue to another, because the London Mayor Sadiq Khan is coming under increasing pressure to drop his plans for a further expansion of the ultra-low emission zone because of the cost of living crisis. The proposed extension would cover all of Greater London, but while the Mayor insists it's a crucial move in the fight against air pollution, many people are worried about the financial impact. Bexley doesn't feel like London. People here refer to it as a village. You can see why. Yet it's just 15 miles from Piccadilly Circus and would be inside Sadiq Khan's expanded ultra-low emission zone. As far as Sharon is concerned, that would be a disaster for her coffee shop, already reeling from a post-COVID drop in trade.
It will just totally wipe out my business that I've built up over the last 3 years, because people come in from everywhere to have an afternoon tea. They're not going to pay £12.50 on top to come in, pay parking as well, and then pay for my afternoon tea as well. It's a bit expensive.
Bexley has a railway station, but many businesses rely on customers who come by car. They fear the ULEZ will simply drive them away.
It will make a massive difference. Well, not just to my business, to everybody's business, to the whole village. We need people to come in, especially after COVID. It's crazy. I just think perhaps the Mayor hasn't got a hand on how businesses run.
City Hall claims more than 100,000 cars and vans a day will be taken off the roads. The expanded ULEZ will help in the battle against climate change and cut the sort of exhaust pollution blamed for 4,000 premature deaths in London every year.
So we want to expand the benefits that we've seen in inner London to the whole of London. Why should people in outer London not have the same clean air policies that people in inner London have hitherto enjoyed? So that's really what we want to do. Massively increase the benefit of reducing those NOx and other harmful particulate matter from vehicles.
MPs from outside Greater London point out many of their constituents regularly cross the border to places like Bexley.
This proposal from Sadiq Khan to expand the ULEZ scheme right out to the edge of outer London has got nothing to do with the control of pollution and everything to do with actually raising revenue. It's a form of taxation on the motorists. And of course it's taxation primarily on people who don't even live in London. So this is quite literally taxation without representation.
The Mayor's public consultation ends next month. If he decides to go ahead, the expanded ultra-low emission zone covering all of Greater London will arrive next summer. Sam, are your constituents wild about being embraced by the extended ULEZ?
Look, anyone who's got a car that's a polluting car and is impacted by this is of course going to be angry about it. There's no doubt about it. I have a lot of sympathy for the businesses. But let's be realistic here. The vast majority of cars on the roads, whether they be in Bexley or whether they be in Ilford, are not ones that are going to be caught by the ULEZ charge. It's actually impacting the cars at the worst polluting types. And at the same time, by the way, the Mayor is proposing a much more serious scrappage.
Those are the older cars. Those are the cars that poorer people have.
And that's why the Mayor's saying this has to happen alongside a serious scrappage scheme to allow.
Well, he said that last time, and the government didn't agree to it, didn't sign up to it. That does need to be part of the package.
That does need to happen, and the Mayor is looking at all of the different options to allow that scrappage scheme to take place. The reality is, well, lots of people said when you first brought the ULEZ in, it's going to do all the same things that concerned business owner said were going to happen, and didn't actually come to pass. There weren't businesses that collapsed over this. There weren't, massive losses of takings. It just doesn't been bared out in the evidence of what happened. I think actually we have got a responsibility to thousands of people, young and old, who die every year needlessly because of the inability to tackle this pollution.
Sam has a point. I mean, despite the scaremongering, business usually manages to survive. You were an MP for Richmond Park, a slightly more well-heeled area than Sam's constituency. That people there will also be included in the expanded ULEZ.
No, we're already in the ULEZ area. Our people, again, had a lot of the kind of fears that have just been described. What I didn't realise at first was that if you have a petrol car that was made in 2006 or later, you're fine under this scheme. I think everybody at first thought, oh my goodness, I've got to get a hybrid car or an electric car or something else like that. It actually is quite a modest scheme in that sense. So relatively few people, I suppose, have cars that are more than 17 years old. There will be some. And I do think it is essential to have a scrappage scheme for them. And that probably has to be, you can't have the scheme unless there's a scrappage mechanism. But it will be relatively few cars that will end up being financed by scrappage, because there are relatively few, frankly, that are that old. But I am really, I think there could be some flexibility around the date to give people a bit more time to plan, a bit more time to decide how they're going to handle it. I think there are ways like that. But ultimately, in the long run, that pollution has a big impact on the lives, particularly of our kids. I mean, it is a serious cause of physical illness, and I can certainly understand the need to get rid of it.
Andrew, the Mayor won a convincing mandate just over a year ago. There's really nothing you can do to object to this, is there?
Well, there's loads that we can do. I mean, this sort of gesture politics that the Mayor's getting involved in, £400 million worth of taxpayers' money is being used to introduce it. And who's going to be paying? The very poorest. It's not going to be the people in the nice plush cars. They're already compliant. It's going to be those people that I've been talking to, NHS workers who work in inner London. They're now going to be charged £12.50 in order to get into an early shift where there is no public transport. They're going to be charged £12.50. And they're now talking about moving outside London with the chronic understaffing that we've got within the NHS in inner London. That's the effect. And it always, Sadiq Khan's policies always fall on the people least able to pay. And you go on about a scrappage scheme. He's always talking about a scrappage scheme, and we get that from Khan. He talks and talks and talks and never delivers. The Conservatives on the London Assembly have been badgering to get a proper scrappage scheme in place for years, and yet he doesn't respond. He wants all his initiatives to be funded by someone else, and I often wonder why on earth he stood to be Mayor of London, because he does nothing, and when the problems come up, he blames someone else. And that's exactly what we've got with the ULEZ expansion.
Mandate.
The Mayor has called repeatedly on the government to do more to help the poorest in London with the cost of living crisis. Wouldn't postponing the extension be a gesture on his part?
No, I don't think so. I think that actually we need to be serious in saying that we are taking climate change seriously. It's not some kind of sort of a pie in the sky issue that needs to be debated or sorted out in the future. It needs to be sorted out right now, because actually air pollution and climate change are impacting
the worst
right
air
now.
pollution is in central London and around Heathrow Airport, less so in places like Bexley, and I suspect
but there's still
in your
quite a lot of
constituency.
evidence that NOx in particular and some of the other particulate issues do impact people, particularly children with asthma, and actually there are a number of preventable deaths amongst the older population as well. I'm pretty convinced that when this is rolled out, there will be lots of people saying, oh, you know, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, and that will not come to pass.
It does have very high
at all.
compliance, the existing scheme. I think it's 93% compliance. There's almost nobody paying the £12.50, almost no one. So, you know, if that's reflected again as it moves to outer London, then I do think the heat goes out of a lot of this.
But we could have a mayor who spent that £400 million on introducing zero-emission buses. He hasn't done that. And it's quite ironic that Seb Dance was standing outside the new City Hall, 100 yards from where the Silvertown Tunnel will ultimately be built, which will suck in high emission vehicles right into the centre of London. And yet he talks about air quality, but when it actually comes to delivering on air quality, it's just press releases.
The Silvertown Tunnel is the mayor's Achilles heel when it comes to his green credentials, isn't it?
There's certainly a big debate about the Silvertown Tunnel. There's not enough convincing evidence actually to back up what
a lot of people in your party are opposed to it. Where do you stand?
There are some people. Our position is that we support it and think that it should go ahead, particularly because actually it will benefit the local economy in those areas, and we need to have more jobs for people. And there's a lot of evidence to say this will not only free up the road networks, it will allow more people to be able to create, you know, businesses and jobs and more opportunities.
In the brief time we have left, Susan, can I just talk about Transport for London funding? The present deal runs out on the 24th. That's next Friday.
Exactly.
This is a mess, isn't it?
It is a complete mess. I mean, to me, it's completely outrageous that we don't have a long-term package in place. I mean, I've dealt with transport both, you know, at the national level and obviously at the local London level. This is with transport of all things. You have to be able to do long-term planning. Otherwise, you spend huge amounts of money jumping from one short-term plan to another short-term plan to another. And I really do not understand
Andrew,
why the government hasn't stepped in.
Why
and
won't
sorted
Grant
this.
Shapps provide a new plan?
We just had a pandemic, and I know the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party have been calling for a long-term plan, a long-term funding plan, before the pandemic, during the pandemic. Yes. I mean, how would that have looked if we'd operated we'd put the basis of a long-term plan on the ridership during the pandemic? It would have been ridiculous. Yes, there should be a long-term plan, but we've got to see how ridership in London develops now that we're only just out of the pandemic, and then we can have a conversation with government about a long-term plan. But at the moment, we aren't, because we've come out of that. It is far.
Andrew and Sam, I'm sorry, we've absolutely run out of time. Apologies for that, but thank you tonight to my guests, Sam, Andrew and Susan. I'll be back next month. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.